Good morning. Hi, good morning. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin the first panel, we wanted to draw the your attention to the back of your program. There's a section to write down your thoughts about today's events. This section of your program will be particularly helpful if you would like to join us at the Design Jam this afternoon at 2:30 p.m. And to offer some clarity on what a Design Jam is, we have a brief video.
In 2017, the number of extremist hate groups in the U.S. rose for the fourth consecutive year.
The number of hate crimes rose by 12% last year. In the United States, 10 large cities alone there were well under 1,000 attacks.
But the past 2 years have also seen unprecedented rallies across America of folks coming together to stand against hate.
We want to continue that conversation with you. On Saturday, November 17th, we're inviting you to the Michigan Journal of Lower Farms Design Jam. What's a Design Jam, ask?
Well, actually, I was wondering.
It's very simple.
All together to propose solutions for responding to extremism and combating hate.
We're going to have teams focused on topics such as law enforcement, education, social media and technology, and community engagement. And that's where you come in. On the day of the symposium, we will have speakers from groups such as the Southern Poverty Law Center and the ACLU who will team up with professors, students, and attendees to spark ideas off of one another. Take a look at our website, altassociation-symposium.com to RSVP by November 10th. We can't wait to see you and all of your ideas there.
Great. Thank you. So if you'd like to join the Design Jam, please let us know. Totally fine. So turning to our first panel, it's titled Defining Extremism, and it will question what the consequences are of applying the extremist label to a person, group, or ideology. The moderator for our panel is Professor Don Herzog. Professor Herzog is Edson R. Sunderland Professor of Law here at the University of Michigan. He is a political theorist, and he teaches First Amendment. Professor Herzog.
Thank you. Before we kick off, I just want to invite you to join me. The students have done an extraordinary amount of high-powered work putting this together, and I'd just like to thank them. This is So I've asked the panelists to each kick off with just 5 minutes or so of comments, and then we will talk and open it up to questions and discussion from you guys. So let's begin with David. David Dinielli is Deputy Legal Director at the Southern Poverty Law Center since 2013. There he oversees LGBT rights work and anti-hate litigation. He is an alum of our law school, class of '94. He clerked on the Ninth Circuit, was at Munger, Tolles & Olson in Los Angeles for many years, with a short stint at the Antitrust Division in DOJ. At the Southern Poverty Law Center, he led the trial team that won a first-of-its-kind consumer fraud jury trial against a gay-to-straight conversion operation called Jews Offering New Alternatives to Homosexuality. And he's leading the case against Andrew Anglin, publisher of the Daily Stormer, for launching a troll storm against a Jewish woman in Montana. David.
Thank you. And if I could just echo the comments about the efforts put into this conference, it's really tremendous. So thank you, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And thank you, Professor Herzog. We were talking about the fact that I never took any class from you, but personal, I promise. So I thought to follow up on the group discussion that we just all participated in, I would talk about my institution where I currently work, which is called the Southern Poverty Law Center. Many of you have heard of it. It's based in Montgomery, Alabama. And we fight hate, we teach tolerance, and we seek justice. I'm a lawyer. I'm in the legal department. But we do have an entire department that's called the Intelligence Project that does nothing but monitor, investigate, follow, and write about and expose hate and extremism and hate groups in particular. So I thought it might be helpful just to start this off to give a little background of how we as an institution think of extremism and hate. Not that it is the only way, and I think one of the interesting questions raised in the last conversation was who gets to decide and who gets to name. We're an organization with tremendous clout. We have a nearly $500 million endowment. We employ nearly 400 people. We have a voice that gets heard, but it's legitimate to ask whether our voice is more important than others. So I'll put that out there and people can answer in their own way. We think of extremism as an extremely broad category of ideologies. And there can be political extremism, there can be environmental extremism, there can be animal rights extremism. Political groups, maybe such as the PLO, might fall into the category. Environmental groups, even such as Greenpeace, might be considered by some to be extremist. Animal rights, we know all sorts of people who've done violent acts in the name of protecting animals. Those groups could be considered extremist. Within that broad category, though, we think of hate as a particular subcategory of extremism. And a lot of our efforts are really focused on the causes of hate, the prevention of hate, remedies for violence associated with hate. Hate can manifest in an individual. We find that oftentimes it is stoked or facilitated by someone spending inordinate amounts of time in kind of the cesspool of the echo chambers of internet chat rooms. Examples could be, for example, Dylan Roof, who engaged in the shooting in Charleston, South Carolina. Robert Bowers, who committed or is alleged to have committed the shootings in Pittsburgh most recently, probably follows that pattern as well. Neither Dylan Roof nor Robert Bowers, to our knowledge, is affiliated with what we would call or consider to be a hate group. But of course, there also are groups that also stoke and encourage all forms of hate. And the Southern Poverty Law Center, as a significant portion of its work, every year tries to map out where those groups are and what they're doing and to identify their ideologies. I thought that it'd be helpful for me just to read our official definition of what gets someone on that list. Again, I would say this is our definition. We're private citizens and a nonprofit. There's no official government backing to this definition, and there's no necessarily uniform academic consensus. So this is just off of our website. The Southern Poverty Law Center defines a hate group as an organization that, based on its official statements or principles, the statements of its leaders or its activities, has beliefs or practices that attack or malign an entire class of people, typically for their immutable characteristics. The organizations on our hate group list vilify others because of their race, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or gender identity, prejudices that strike at the heart of our democratic values and fracture society along its most fragile fault lines. So I think one interesting thing about that definition to help understand the work we do, if I hate you, I might be a hateful person, but I'm not going to end up on SPLC's list of hateful people because I might hate you for reasons other than something intrinsic to you as a part of a membership or a group that you belong to, okay? So I read those kind of categories of malign groups that can give someone the notoriety of ending up on the hate group list. Race, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or gender identity. We have faced the most backlash, I believe, in connection with our decisions relating to groups that we have labeled anti-LGBT hate groups. Among the groups that we've labeled are organizations that maybe some of you have heard of, such as Liberty Counsel, which is a legal advocacy organization that, among other things, has represented Roy Moore, the former Chief Justice of Alabama, who had a failed Senate candidacy last year. Another group called the Alliance Defending Freedom, a very prominent group that has litigated a number of cases all the way up to the Supreme Court, most recently the Masterpiece Cake Shop case about the baker in Colorado who did not want to bake a cake for a same-sex couple. Another group is called the Family Research Council. Some of these are very commonplace names and have had a fair degree of prominence in the conservative Christian world. But again, just sticking with this one category of anti-LGBT hate, just want to say, for example, we never label a group just because, for example, they've opposed same-sex marriage or because they think homosexual conduct or identity is sinful or contrary to religious beliefs. Instead, and again, I'm just going to read this so you have a sense, our own description of what does the SPLC consider to be an anti-LGBT hate group. And we say that we list organizations as anti-LGBT hate groups because they use dehumanizing language and pseudo-scientific falsehoods to portray LGBT people as, for example, sick, evil, perverted, and a danger to children and society, or to suggest that LGBT people are more likely to be pedophiles and sexual predators. Now, again, it was very interesting for me to participate in that discussion of reactions to all of the different definitions that had been compiled for what is extremism. I think looking at and reading that definition now that we utilize in deciding who is an anti-LGBT hate group, the focus really is on falsehoods about a group of people that dehumanizes them. Right? Interestingly, there's nothing in this definition that requires that those views be within or without the mainstream, which is a theme that we saw in a lot of those other proposed definitions. And I think that leads to our kind of the final point I want to make about how we view extremism and hate. We do not consider extremism and hate to be things that exist only on the margins of power. To the contrary, what we work against most strongly is what we call the mainstreaming of hate, which is something that, of course, we've seen prominently during the Trump administration. In fact, we believe it is most dangerous when hate becomes a part of the mainstream. We've written a lot about this, but again, just using one of the anti-LGBT hate groups as an example of the kinds of things we monitor. I file FOIA requests and FOIA lawsuits we talk to the press about relating to this group I mentioned called the Alliance Defending Freedom. This group, as I said, bills itself as a Christian advocacy group, but among other things, it's advocated the criminalization of homosexuality here in the United States, the recriminalization of homosexuality. In Europe, it is advocated for the forced sterilization of trans people. And so even though it does, in fact, do legal work, we view these policy statements and statements of bigotry from the leaders of that group to be sufficient to label it as an anti-LGBT hate group, which we believe then sheds light on the motivations for the other kind of work that it does that wouldn't in and of itself get it onto our hate list. ADF has found a very willing ear in recently formerly Attorney General Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III, and has played a pivotal role in a number of anti-LGBT federal policy moves, including, for example, the withdrawal of what's called a Dear Colleague letter that had been issued by the Department of Justice and the Department of Education relating to the protection of trans students in public schools. He was at the table in the development of a directive issued by Jeff Sessions to all federal agencies, imploring them and directing them to give wide berth to claims of religious exemption. He has been working with the Alliance Defending Freedom, and I've may be filing a lawsuit in the next couple of days about this, relating to revisions to the Transgender Offender Manual, which is a manual issued by the Bureau of Prisons that had previously given special protections to trans people in prison, and those have largely been withdrawn as a result of the advocacy of ADF. And also, extremely recently, a leaked proposal generated by HHS and DOJ to seek a broad redefinition of sex in all federal regulations that would essentially exclude transgender people from all civil rights protections. I give those examples just to show that, as I said, hate and extremism need not be on the margins. Oftentimes they can work their way into the very centers of power, and in our view, that's when it becomes the most dangerous. The other comment I will make, and then I'll turn it over, is just something else that came up in the discussion last hour, which is that in our view, neither extremism nor hate requires the use of violence to fall within our definition. Again, ADF as an example, they fight court cases and talk to the Attorney General in order to effectuate their hate. ADF does not itself engage in violence. But our position is that expressions of hatred, even when expressed through, for example, federal regulations, can contribute to an atmosphere in which violence can occur. So that's an overview of our view about hate and extremism, and I'll leave it at that. I hope I wasn't too far over 5 minutes.
Next, thank you. Next up, Rana Elmir is the Deputy Director of the ACLU of Michigan and has devoted her career to storytelling, action, and activism. Rana lectures often on anti-Muslim bias, the importance of storytelling, free speech, and the intersection of race, faith, gender, and sexual orientation. The Washington Post has published 2 op-eds written by Rana, and because it's the web, they will be there forever. One is Stop Asking Me to Condemn Terrorists Just Because I'm Muslim, and the other is How Muslim Women Bear the Brunt of Islamophobia. She's a graduate of Wayne State University's Journalism School and the Journalism Institute for Minorities.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for having me. I think I'm holding it down for the non-attorneys. As well as I think the femmes, right? But I wanted to. So I'm here to talk about specifically, as you can tell by my bio, specifically Muslim rights and anti-Muslim bias. And so I want to start by saying that certainly countering violent extremism, countering radicalization, countering violence is a laudable goal. But I'm here to talk about realities versus the laudable goal of addressing these issues. And so what we've seen over the last 2 decades and beyond is that in an attempt to counter violent extremism, in an attempt to, I should be using like air quotes, in an attempt to counter radicalization, the US is engaged in the targeting, surveillance, profiling, and discriminatory actions that criminalize Muslims for simply being Muslim, for simply their beliefs and their religious and even cultural practices. It's not even about religiosity, it's simply an association with Islam. And so what the government has done for years, and we are right now in another moment in which we have elected officials who are being pressed by the public. Perhaps many of you in this room, I know I feel this as well, although I'm conscious of the way in which consequences impact my communities. But we're in this moment where we want to deal with white supremacy. We want to deal with hate. There's this rise. And so there's this reaction to tell our elected officials, pass more laws, build out more tools for law enforcement. Well, I can tell you that these agencies, our federal government, often use this public tolerance and public willingness to use aggressive police actions as a way to target and discriminate and surveil and profile Muslims. There are clear consequences to giving law enforcement more tools, and those consequences have a direct line to the Muslim communities. And so I want to specifically talk about one case study in this, and I'm not even going to talk about a federal program like CVE. Many of you may have gone to the session with Khalid Beydoun yesterday, but what's that? Oh, sorry. Okay, maybe I will talk about CVE later. But I want to talk about the ways in which, because we're far more connected to local police departments than we are to the FBI and to federal agencies. And so I want to talk about the NYPD surveillance program. How many of you are familiar with the NYPD surveillance program? Oh, good. Usually no hands are raised for that. And so for those of you who don't know, in 2013, the Associated Press, through an investigation, found that the New York Police Department was engaged in a decades-long surveillance and mapping program of Muslim communities in 5 boroughs in New York, as well as reaching Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. And when I talk about wholesale surveillance, I mean wholesale surveillance. This is dragnet surveillance. And so what they did was they specifically targeted Muslim individuals, organizations, social and political organizations, businesses, and of course religious institutions, including student associations like the MSA, which many of you worked with for the purposes of planning this event. And the program was connected to the CIA in that the principal architect of this program had a long career in the CIA. And it was built on this false premise that religious behavior and religiosity, and not necessarily those two together, just religious behavior and then separately religiosity, were a predictor of violent behavior alone, were a predictor of radicalization, the radicalization that Sammy talked about earlier. And the reason I'm bringing this up is when we talk about defining extremism, we really don't have, as we saw in that exercise, a good definition, but what we do have is what the federal government and what law enforcement agencies have used as indicators of radicalization. So how many of you can throw out some guesses as to what was on the list of indicators of radicalization? Any guesses? A beard, yep. Anyone else? What's that? Yeah, I don't think they were looking at, Brooklyn hipsters when they were setting this up. Anything else? Anna?
Going to the mosque.
Going to the mosque, yep. Come on, keep it coming. Quick.
Hijab.
Hijab. Hijab, not just hijab, but traditional dress altogether. Anybody else?
Travel. Travel to the Middle East.
Yep, travel. One more and then I'll give you the rest.
Accent.
What's that?
An accent.
An accent? Sure, we'll throw that in there. It was probably in there. The other ones were social activism or political activism. Even though we show studies that the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding has done, that in fact going to the mosques makes you more engaged civically, not less engaged civically, right? And we also have not drinking alcohol. Maybe you stopped gambling suddenly. Those were all indicators of radicalization. So what did they do? They essentially had two parts to the program. There were rakers. These are undercover police officers that were just thrown out all over into the city, into the boroughs, into Connecticut and these other states. And they produced reports that were put into a database. And they mainly focused on what they called hotspots, or incubators of radicalization. Who could guess what incubators of radicalization are? Mosques. Mosques, okay, that's an easy one. Come on, guys. You could do better. Universities, especially MSAs. They in fact infiltrated MSAs and went on some weird trip that they were taking to go whitewater rafting or something. Hookah shops, cafes, halal butchers. They even looked at which stores were closing for prayer. That became an indicator of radicalization. Which cafes were playing Al Jazeera, right, was an indicator of radicalization. And all of this information was put into a database. And we know that these databases aren't just for one person to look at. They're for all law enforcement agencies to populate and to produce reports from. And so, I could go on, but I want to stop there and just say, this is just one example. But across the board, when you look at the ways in which law enforcement has targeted Muslim communities, you see these indicators of radicalization that are completely built on junk science that connect Muslim religiosity, Muslim conservatism, Muslim practice with the act of aggression or with the act of extremism or violent radicalization. I'll end by saying this, and so as you move into your day and as you move into your design jam, I'd really ask you to reject attempts to give law enforcement more tools to do this work. because we know that the consequences are clearly going to be felt most of all by Muslim communities, and specifically Muslim women, and I could talk about that a little bit later. We cannot use systems that are built on white supremacy and benefit from white supremacy to end the scourge of white supremacy. It just does not work that way.
Thanks. This is, among other things, a reminder that part of thinking about how law can be used to combat extremism is thinking about how law promotes extremism on the ground in response to what the law does. So, next up, Javed Ali is Harry A. and Margaret D. Towsley policymaker in residence at the Ford School for the fall 2018 semester, and a former senior director for counterterrorism at the National Security Council. He has over 20 years of professional experience in national security and intelligence issues in Washington, D.C. He's worked in the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI. He too is an alum. He's got a BA in political science from Michigan. He's got a JD from the University of Detroit School of Law, and an MA in International Relations from American University.
Don, thank you for that introduction, and again, real honor for me to be here. Thanks to Kara, to Ashlyn, everyone else who helped put this together. And thanks for providing a little bit of a snapshot of my bio. So I am coming from a very different end of the spectrum as other panelists here. So I, as Don mentioned, recently finished a fairly long stretch in government, but with my government experience, and then I was a contractor before 9/11, about 20 years combined experience in counterterrorism and intelligence in Washington, D.C., so have a pretty good sense of what the government kind of world on these kind of issues looked like up until very recently this summer. So wanted to provide a few sort of thoughts about sort of this definitional issue and some of the struggles we've had on the government side. So let me first talk about some of the frameworks, and then I'll give you some enterprise perspectives as someone who's looked at counterterrorism across the board in Washington for 20 years, especially with my last position at the White House, and then potentially offer some solutions as well. So starting with the frameworks, one thing, interestingly, we haven't talked about today, or at least I haven't heard, is the federal statute on terrorism. So let's do a little bit of an exercise here. How many people know that there's a federal statute on terrorism? Or, okay, there's one hand, a couple hands here. And then, do you actually know what the definition says? And if you don't, I'm going to read it right now, because I do think it's a little different from the conversation we've had already. So this is coming from 28 CFR section 0.85, if anyone's looking to cite it. So it says, the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations defines terrorism as the unlawful use of force and violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political or social objectives. So that is the federal government's definition of terrorism. What you don't find in that definition is anything about ideology, extremism, radicalization. So that's something that has sort of shaped the government's response to the sort of the ideology issue. So again, someone who's got 20 years of experience in Washington on this topic from inside the government, I would say that the government's focus on at least the ideological side of the spectrum of counterterrorism didn't really start until after 9/11. And it was only probably in the early years of the Bush administration that beyond sort of the offensive side of counterterrorism, which we really went fairly heavy after 9/11, that we started to think about, well, there's this other side of the issue that we haven't really done anything. And then that's kind of what started that whole process. And I think we tried since that time frame, over the last 15 years, to kind of bucket this sort of governmental perspective, or at least the federal one, on different aspects. So first, identify sort of that signs of the ideological sort of radicalization, as was just mentioned. Then there was sort of going beyond identification to potentially preventing it from happening. And then if you failed in either identifying and preventing, then countering it. And not only just thinking about the hard end of countering from a disruption, but potentially over the last few years, sort of providing a little bit more thought to off-ramps or things beyond just sort of an enforcement action. As was mentioned already, so in the early days after 9/11, we started to think about the potential of this, the Al-Qaeda message sort of resonating inside the United States. And for the most part, that was a good news story. That really didn't take hold here. But there were isolated incidents of it. So even then, we were trying to figure out, why is this happening here in the United States it was happening in far greater degree in Western Europe. So that's when we started to look at, okay, how is this process of radicalization on that Al-Qaeda sort of message or brand occurring in the US, and could we unpack it in a meaningful way? And what we came to realize, fairly quickly, was that there was no common process. There was multiple drivers of individual radicalization. There was no geographic hotspots inside the United States. And there were really few legal options, at least on the federal side, to prevent people from becoming radicalized, to that Al-Qaeda sort of brand. So then we transitioned, probably a few years after that, to, well, we can't really stop people from being radicalized, nor, arguably do we want to, as long as they're not trending on that path to political violence. So then we thought, well, maybe we need to reshift our focus to potentially identifying behaviors of mobilization to violence, because that's when you start getting closer to that federal terrorism statute that I referenced before. So we did a little bit better work, I think, in terms of looking at those signs of mobilization to violence and then offering potential options and solutions to other folks who are on the front line of that inside the United States to say, well, if you see someone sort of trending in this direction, here's potentially some things you might want to do about that, but not, again, with just arresting them is the first thing. But then looking at this a little more broadly from an enterprise perspective, and again, I had a couple of positions which gave me that perspective in my last few years of government service, is that for the most part, our federal government is really not structured for countering political ideology. There's no single agency in charge of this mission. There's these divides between the foreign and domestic side of countering ideology. There's an issue of prioritization. Is this really that important of a national security mission that we need to break some bureaucratic China to create a single agency? We don't have a lot of expertise on the different aspects of this inside the government. I can say that as someone who was doing this for 20 years. This mission already doesn't get a lot of money in the federal counterterrorism space. Like I said, we don't have a lot of legal tools. And then there are all these other things that probably aren't well developed as well. We don't have robust partnerships with private industry. There's state and local government partnerships that are still lacking, and then some of the issues with local communities. So from the federal side, this is still something that, the ground has not been plowed completely on this, and there's probably a lot more work that needs to be done if it's going to continue to be a priority. And lastly, looking at some potential solutions, there might be tools the government can provide to state and local partners, whether in the government or private organizations, local communities, again, to help spot these sort of signs of mobilization to violence. One thing that's potentially been considered, but obviously our government hasn't gone in that direction. We have not passed any legislation on hate speech the way that you've seen European countries do. I would refer you to what's happened in the UK. There's something called the Public Order Act of 1986, and over the past 30 years there's been amendments to this order. So now in the UK, you can get prosecuted for tweeting something that's considered hateful or having an ISIS piece of propaganda on your laptop. They will put you in jail for something like that. In Germany, there's something called the Germany Net Enforcement Act. So other European partners are thinking of ways legally to criminalize some of this behavior, but we have not, again, on more the ideological side of this here inside the United States. Another potential option is to provide more funding for study and research on this issue to academia, to researchers. Again, that's not something that the government has done a lot of because we don't have the expertise in-house for the most part. And then, again, there's this potential of creating a new government structure that would bring some of these disparate kind of parts of the government together that are tackling this piecemeal, but I'm not sure there's an appetite for that right now. So.
Thanks. My First Amendment antenna are getting twitchy as I listen to this. So finally, Yazier Henry teaches at the Ford School. He's a political strategist, conflict management expert, scholar, and professional human rights advocate. He's written and published on the political economy of societal trauma, identity, race, peace processes, truth commissions, and international transitional justice. And he's particularly interested in how state violence is systematically institutionalized during political transitions.
Thank you. Is this thing on?
Yes.
Can you hear me? I generally speak very softly, a power voice. Again, thank you. I mean, to the team that invited me and to the symposium, and thank you for coming. I don't want to repeat much of what has been said, so I will take a transitional tack here into the next session. I want to start with Elie Wiesel's quote that the opposite of love is not hate, it is indifference. And I want to state categorically and unapologetically that I'm a scholar and an academic also. And that I think it's important for those of us, for you and me, here in the academy, to own our responsibility to the intellectual and the political life of the society that invests in us to do our work. It's too easy sometimes to point the finger and mobilize concepts like the community over there outside. That means a community in pain, hurting, or living every day in the context of survival, sometimes economic, but other times political, and other times extremely traumatic, atmospheric, in terms of its sensibility to being aggressed as a targeted person, collective, or population. The term, or any term for that matter, that relates to an effect and consequences, a consequence that may or may not be mobilized at the interpretive, even at the methodological, as well as the political and ideological level, is not innocent. Oftentimes it has a story, it has a history, and it definitely has a consequence and a purpose. So when I come to this term, and when I was asked to think about the term, and as I said previously, I do not wish to repeat some of the most important conversations that has already occurred, but I think that words such as these, concepts such as these, which carry inherent political potential as definition, as definitive, has to be understood in terms of how it is mobilized, deployed, where it is used, by who it is used, against who it is used. And so it is important to consider the word, a word, even a simple definition, as an active term in political life of the world. And I don't necessarily want to stay as myopic, yeah, since I think, as Javed correctly said, this is a large issue globally that faces the world. So, the term and word has to be made sense of, for it is insensible or even nonsensical without a careful consideration of how it is being mobilized and against who it is mobilized. I would argue that the term, therefore, is at once a political term, a legal term, or in some cases an illegal term. It is moral, it is ethical, and it is definitely normative. It is an ideological discourse term with extreme effects and consequences that must be understood in the context of life and death. Lived life and lived death, social and political life and social and political death. What is my purpose, your purpose as a professional, legally, or those of you from our school, politically, and in narrow policy terms, if not to think the world in a more peaceable way, would be my argument, as it relates to the extreme range endpoints of the personal, the individual, to the broader ethico-juridical and constitutive points of structural and political life as systemic life. Is not the purpose of the law the purpose of political justice, not peace? The ability to peaceably live in a pluralist society, in a democratic society with people different, if that is the case in such a society. So, I would like to end by saying that the complex universe of this term has to be considered, and it is not only my responsibility as a scholar or the responsibility of a number of my colleagues here working at the cold face, proverbially. It is all our responsibility. If you have a commitment, intellectually and politically, legally, to this supposed concept of the peace that everybody bandies about, throws about, and realizes and forgets that it is real in terms of life and death, not only of a community, but in the terms of an entire membership community of constitutional life. If you wish to consider yourself a Democrat, and I don't mean in narrow political terms, but in existential political, normative, legal, and political terms, do you care about your neighbors? Do you care about yourself? Do I care about myself enough to remember why democracy exists in terms of the peace relative to the terror of France in the modernist, narrow ideological sense of where Europe comes from? So, what is your responsibility? What is your generation? What is my generational responsibility? What is our responsibility to the peace? If you wish to live in peace, and if you wish to live peaceably with one another, outside of the discourse extremes of ideological apprehension that looks at me as far enough to the end of humanity so that I can be aggressed because of my skin color. Defined outside of what? In relationship to who? Now, words are serious in the law and in politics, and you as students, as well as me as a scholar, has a responsibility to clarifying those words in its context, in its complex context. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to throw it open to questions from the audience. Do you want people to come up to these mics? Or you want to pass them around? So hands up and someone will cheerfully bring you a microphone.
All this is just a symptom of the ills of society, the shortcomings of society. You know, you have so many examples of this money laundering. We have lost the war globally against money laundering, and we will never win that. Terrorism financing is just a form of money laundering. Our education system, where you have the lawsuits in the city of Detroit against the state of Michigan and others saying that these kids are not being taught to read, and the state of Michigan was successful in arguing that they have no obligation under law to train people to read. The health system, our roads, you keep going on, it's one, and the issues seem to be moral hazard has won out. We have not been able to successfully beat that back. I think the key is education, and two examples. One is the fight against smoking. If you blast that out on every medium, every day, all the time, eventually you're going to win. The second example is the past political round, the last 2 years. If you repeat a lie enough times, it becomes believed as true. It's all a matter of education. And that, I think, is key to not passing a law saying, preventing ideological issues and stuff like that. You could have laws against violence, but it's education at the core, trying to change the view of society to beat back moral hazards and the other issues that are going to solve this. Enough said?
Let me just jump in on that. So again, wearing my former federal government hat, that one thing we try to do, again, thinking a little bit more creatively about the counter-ideological fight in this was trying to bring in parts of the federal government into that national security world that never used to play in that mission space before. So we did try to bring in Department of Education, Health and Human Services, parts of our government that never, prior to 9/11, would interact with the national security community to at least think about some potential options or solutions to help on that counter-ideological fight.
The government is too small to do it alone.
Right, so I'm just giving you the federal perspective, but at least we tried at that effort. Still hasn't probably paid the right dividends, but whatever those silos were before 9/11, at least they don't exist now.
And if I can add to that, I would say it also depends on who is leading that fight. Is it the Department of Education that is leading? Is it the Department of Health and Human Services that is leading? Or is it still the Department of Justice, the FBI, the National Counterterrorism Center? Who is leading the counter-radicalization or counter-extremist battle? And what we've seen is when it's the DOJ, when it's DHS, and they view themselves as a hammer, and when you're a hammer, everything is a nail, right? So this issue is a public health issue, it's a mental health issue, it's an issue of education, yet we're using law enforcement tactics to address it. And so I'll give you an example. I believe this is out of Northern California. A young man's family began to notice that he was going on certain websites, he was talking a certain way about his religious ideology. They were very concerned. They called the FBI and they said, please help our son. The FBI launched a sting operation with him. He's now in prison. This could have been prevented had we dealt with it as an education issue, as a public health issue, as a mental health issue. But we only have one way to handle these situations, and that's through law enforcement tactics. And law enforcement tactics are only designed in one way, and that is to be punitive, not rehabilitative. That is perhaps the greatest myth of our criminal justice system.
Hi, thank you for all of your comments. I'd like to know what the panelists think about how, at the grassroots level, a strong protest against extremist ideology is able to succeed without being perceived politically as just a battle of ideologies. In other words, take this state which is trying to, through the Board of Education, change the way that we're looking at social history, and trying to say that the KKK, for instance, is just a political organization as opposed to being an actual hate organization. What's in the 21st century toolkit to help us at the grassroots level make it so that it's not just a political fight? And I'd like to know, hopefully from each of you, what your thoughts are.
Thanks. Maybe I'll just start by saying that at the SPLC we do have an entire program called Teaching Tolerance, which is devoted to helping educators of all sorts introduce concepts around identity, around hate at a very early level in the public schools and all schools, frankly. We publish articles, we develop curricula. One of the things that we've done most recently is develop an entire set of curricula and training materials for teachers under an umbrella called Teaching Hard History. And it's largely a response to this notion, I think, that was raised by you, and I'm forgetting your name, about a lack of consciousness about our own history with respect to racial violence and other forms of hate and bigotry within our own country, specifically around racism and the Civil War. I think this is critical. I'll tell you, a lot of the work I'm doing right now has to do with Confederate monuments and iconography around the country. And we have been involved in a number of pieces of litigation. We've been involved in a number of outreach efforts trying to think about opportunities for litigation to get our message out. I've been working with schools in Montgomery, Alabama, for example, named after Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee. And what we're finding is that most of the students in those schools don't know who those people are. Literally do not know who those people are. One of my colleagues did Teach for America in the Mississippi Delta. He taught 8th grade. All of the students were black. None of them had heard of slavery. Right? So this is not necessarily grassroots, but I think equipping the people who are working with young people can be both grassroots, but also through the educational system. And I would really urge you to take a look at our programming on that and see if there's a way to kind of magnify that in the communities that you might have contacts with. It's really pretty wonderful stuff and very easy to be kind of incorporated into curricula at the school level.
As much as I understand the way the term grassroots is mobilized, I do want to say that it's important to also, at the same time, think about the meaning of leadership in any aspect, in any institutional site of society. Coming from an extremely poor upbringing, it's not accidental. Socioeconomic violence is not accidental. It is the result of structure and system is the result of people. And I think it's important that consequences are addressed in that way. I mean, as a want to resist this narrow sometimes, and I don't say you said that, right? I'm just throwing it out more generally. This narrow anti-intellectualism that is oftentimes imposed on the grassroots without understanding how serious, thinking must be taken even in environments that exist outside of a place where thinking is institutionally the supposed purpose of our lives. Having just recently met with some young people from Chicago and Parkland who were here at the university recently, I'll echo what some of their thoughts were in terms of inspiring not only change but hopeful action in the context of surviving traumatically the experience of lived everyday violence that hate and indifference is learned also. Doesn't start necessarily at the consequential act. Sometimes it starts in the mind, but where does that beginning come from? I would want to ask. And then what is the responsibility of all of us? To counter-navigate that in its most smallest forms. When extremism comes, and I want to echo what was said by my colleague over here, when it comes to occupy the center, what then is our responsibility? Not only at the level of the so-called grassroots or the exiled community from this intellectual core, but what is our responsibility every day? The little victories. Lamar from Chicago said, he's inspired by this idea of being a prisoner of hope. And so, this is a hopeful act, and you are doing something quite different that, this parking lot that used to be a parking lot wasn't ever used to. So those of you who are new into law school don't know that you took our parking lot at the law school. And we still kind of feel a little bit about it. But now that I'm going to see the fireplace, I'm okay. So I think the little victories are important in the context when people feel really down and there's an extreme violent atmosphere, would be my argument. And leadership is important at every level.
Hi, I have a question for Professor Ali and others as well. You mentioned something about fighting political ideology and how that's decentralized among the federal government. What does that term mean, and what would a centralized unit look like? Because it seems kind of like a dangerous tool, as as Rana had mentioned?
First, thanks for the question. And as I told my students in my class, do not call me Professor Ali. That will automatically get you a demerits. John, it is fine. Because I've never taught before coming to here at Michigan. But anyways, so that is a great question. And the issue with the political ideology for the federal government, I mean, there's so many sort of challenges, wrapped up in that. But, one thought would be, if some part of the government was going to take that mission on, just assume that, for example, if you can get through all the legal hurdles and the bureaucratic ones, where would it land? Would it be in the Department of Homeland Security? Would it be in the Department of Justice? Would it be in an organization I used to work in, the National Counterterrorism Center? I mean, no, it doesn't fit neatly in any one of the current places right now. And that's why you've seen a lot of hesitation already at the federal level. Nobody really wants to take it because no one is optimized to do it anyways. Because again, you have a foreign component and a domestic component, and no one single agency would have remit over both sides of it. And then there's just the whole issue of what is the government's role in combating political ideology, for all of the reasons I just laid out. So this is something I think that's going to continue to be a conversation. One sort of potential indicator of where this administration might go, the administration actually released its counterterrorism strategy. So I'd point you to that if you haven't seen it already. And that was something when I was at the White House, when I was there for that year, we actually were trying to get that document out, so we failed miserably on that front, but at least it got published about a month ago. And in it, interestingly enough, there actually is language about how the government needs to do better on combating ideology or radical ideology. I can't remember the right term they use. But that at least gives me hope that it's not going to be just, we're going to forget about that aspect of the fight, but how that will get rearranged or reorganized, I'm not sure what the answer is, but at least through the lens of that strategy, which theoretically departments and agencies will now have to do something against because the White House will be measuring their implementation of it, hopefully we'll see some progress on it. But it is something that the government right now still hasn't figured out how to crack that code. But it's a good question.
This will be our last question.
Make it good.
Yeah, exactly.
No pressure. So there's kind of this thought that extremism is negative. I mean, just the title of this entire symposium is Combating Extremism, which kind of leaves this negative slant to it. And I was just wondering if there's kind of a push or a movement to redefine that into a more positive or neutral term, and if there's value in creating something that's not a negative extremism kind of perception in the public.
I'll say just a little bit about that. I'm basically where Alex was before, if you were there. A lot depends on, maybe everything depends on what purpose you want to use the word for, right, or what setting it's being invoked in. So like, if you're studying American public opinion, you might think like, well, a lot of policy questions, responses fall in a bell curve, and you're an extremist if you're in the tail of the curve, one side or the other, and nothing yet follows about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Or if we can summon up the glory days of Barry Goldwater's Extremism and the Pursuit of Virtue is No Vice, that was a picture of like, if you're fighting the good fight, like fight hard. And so, and I assume the context here is the thought that there is some murky, amorphous, worrisome problem that needs a legal solution. And that in turn could be splintered, like there might be one picture of extremism which would be helpful if you're trying to figure out when, if ever, should criminal punishment be enhanced with a hate crime provision. There might be another one if you want to tackle the question of when, if anything, should the government get interested in snooping on what you're up to. But if the setting is the collection, the bundle of like things we think of are problematic to which we might want the law to turn, it's not clear why we'd want a definition that underlying was positive about the phenomena.
me
Go
do
ahead.
that. You did it earlier. I'm going to defer. Respect you.
So I'm trying to figure out how to formulate this without being dismissive, because I'm genuinely not dismissive, but I have to say I am not interested in defining extremism. I am interested in knowing how we criminalize it, who we criminalize, why we criminalize them, how, did I say how? That for me is really the crux of this conversation, and you see that, I think, in everybody's comments today. While we're looking for a definition of it, I think we may lose sight of how it's applied and who it's applied. The conversation we had earlier was such a fruitful conversation because it really gets to that. What is the government's interest in defining extremism? What is the government's interest in creating and giving new tools to law enforcement? What is the government's interest in giving money, particularly law enforcement, giving money to local communities to combat or fight radicalization? What is the government's interest in data collection around these ideas? What is the government's interest in looking exclusively at Muslim communities and Black communities? What is the government's interest in identifying Black identity extremists as a national security threat, essentially conflating anti-racism work with threats? So that's where I'm at, and so I really have to say I struggled with and I always do, I struggle with the notion of what is extremism, what is radicalization, because I think where I'm focused is how do those things manifest and hurt and harm the communities I care about the most.
I'd like to add, in a sense, that, I can't think about it as narrowly, in that way, but I accept what you're saying in terms of how you and the community that you come from, where you care, but for me, it's important to always remember that when talking about these issues, it's not in a vacuum, politically or ethically. Change happens in a multiplicit and multi-sectional direction. The future, or the peace of the future, is not simply so guaranteed as oftentimes too many people want to think. It's not an accident that between 200 and 400 million people were killed in order to establish what we now call modernity across the world. I come from the southern cone of Africa. We'll continue to live with the consequences of colonization, what an apartheid system meant when it set Black life up for a slow genocide through the law. Not necessarily in its acts in terms of the defense of its law, but just everyday living. And when we talk together here, it's important not to remember that we're not only talking in the terms of definition, outside of its application to human life, it's real. Peace is no simple dove being thrown into the air. Oftentimes it's after tens of decades of people working not only in and through the law, but in political and social life in order to continue to maintain a faith in humanity so that hopefully there's something better at the end of that tunnel that sometimes seems so dark. But that is, when it's dark, it's my responsibility and yours to be the light. Otherwise, we're just going to be knocking up against the wall of so-called definition and say that we have no responsibility for the consequences that too many in our community have to live every day as violent life, as every day, whether it's at the extreme edge of the economy regardless of color. Yeah? In my humble opinion, I mean, we have to be able to step out and beyond who it is we narrowly identify ourselves with, to understand that there's a larger society that we have to find ourselves in order to build that peace we so easily yak about. It's real. It exists in the law. It exists in our policies. It exists in the absence of the law and in the absence of policy, and it affects actual people, you and I, and those not so lucky and so privileged enough to sit here, yeah, and try to seem intelligent and just talk. Talk is not innocent. And I mean, I'm sorry that I'm a little bit what sometimes people can define as passionate, but I'm talking in the context of 400 million dead. How can I not be outraged? So, with that said, I'll go back to my professional academic hat, because normally in my class I don't speak like this, okay? It's normally very even keeled. So I'll shut up now.
Thanks to the members of the panel and thanks to the audience.
Just quickly, on behalf of the team, we want to thank Don and the panelists for their time and insight this morning, and thank all of you for your attention and engagement.